Having the ability to live in an urban area with accessible mass transit and walkability is the definition of personal freedom. As somebody who has a disability that inhibits and restricts my ability to drive a car, it is a necessity of life. Urban planning has become such a large part of my life over the last several years, and I am immensely grateful to all the friends I've made and the stuff that I've learned. It's been wonderful. Ironically, though, right now I'm in the least urban, least developed place I can think to be in due to personal reasons. This is how the sidewalks look pretty much everywhere within 60 miles or so of where I live. There's nowhere to walk comfortably, let alone bike. If you don't have a car, you're pretty much going nowhere. Uber is massively inflated if you can even afford it. The idea of mass transit here just doesn't come up. It's all single family detached homes, even when there is a lot of land that can be developed into what urbanists would describe as a perfectly normal mid-size neighborhood. So what I've decided we're going to do is play some NIMBY Rail and talk about this stuff. Something I've noticed for far too long is that a plurality of content in English on urban planning comes out of Canada. Canada is around 81% urban, but more importantly, as an outside observer, you're all smushed together within 50 kilometers or so of the US border. And so, at least to me, the vast majority of Canadians are either in an urban area like Vancouver or Montreal or Winnipeg or Ottawa. And so you have access to transit immediately at your doorstep. It's a fact of life. And if you are in a place like London or Mississauga, you still have trains that are, meant to take you as a commuter into Toronto. While there is still a lot of bad suburbanization in Canada, to be sure, there's a space for discussion and there's a room for people to talk about changes that need to be made. By contrast, in the United States, cities are very spread out and there's a history of demonizing density, a history of condemning cities as some kind of, bad place to live as opposed to the supposedly clean, proper suburbs. Atomized. It's a very atomized existence. While many cities do have mass transit, Denver, Chicago, Buffalo, Philly, Charlotte, access often in our modern day is, barred by high rent. It isn't as if you have access to it as a rule. It's a perk of living in a desirable area, quote unquote. Whereas in much of the rest of the world, it's just a fact that you have access to some kind of transit. As someone who grew up in the Northeast, I really took Amtrak for granted. Being able to bike down to the station and go into New York whenever I wanted. Where I live now in the Sun Belt, people could care less about any kind of mass transit or good urban design because all they've ever known is the car. The thought of densifying and bringing in these, new ideas brings to mind very negative connotations. I'm sure you all can imagine the preconceived notions. The intersection between I can afford to live here and this place has decent transit are pretty much separate circles. Don't get me wrong, it would be great to live in Chicago or DC, but for right now that doesn't feel realistic. People tell me that I should start working remotely from a small town, and they don't seem to understand that most American small towns I've been to are not walkable. The cost in to cost out is just doesn't work mathematically. And I wrote about this a bit in a Substack recently, where I noted that many people miss the amenities of city life once they finally move out to the supposedly great countryside, eventually deciding to move back because the amenities just won't come. The fact of the matter is that despite having a majority of the population living in urban areas like Canada, the character of urban areas in the States is not the same. While they do exist, there's very little public transit for Americans to rely on. The majority of American cities are too dispersed to have transit be accessible to the same degree. I'm not asking for Tokyo levels of accessibility here. Just look at Berlin or Montreal for examples. If US cities do have mass transit, it seems to be not given priority at the expense of the car, and it seems as if many are only easily accessible to those who can pay highly inflated rents because cities just haven't built properly dense neighborhoods in decades. Atlanta, the closest major city with a mass transit system, is still seen as heavily car dependent because the system itself was not fundamentally designed to be mass transit. It feels like a vanity project. New Jersey, the Northeast, areas around Chicago, and a few others are really the places where good growth is possible, in my personal opinion. They have the good bones that make mass transit and walkable, multimodal cities viable again. What climate change can do to our cities, and with economic shifts happening every year, we need cities to be more resilient and more transit forward, not less. This 70-year-old idea that we all need to have our own home in a nice little suburb with a car and a 2-car garage feels almost hostile in its dogma. It is spoken about as if it's something that everyone can achieve and everyone wants, when many people are starting to want an alternative, and they have wanted an alternative for a long time. We all know that the most economically viable and sustainable cities are those with density, where you don't need to find a remote job or use a car to drive 15 minutes to the nearest grocery store. The United States does have those places, but again, they're in such few of a number to be almost minuscule. Outside of DC or New York or Chicago, I don't begrudge people for enjoying suburban life. I'm sure that there are a lot of benefits if you can find a good suburb, or if you can drive and, live in the confines of a 15-minute drive to a grocery store or whatever. But the fact is that there are no, or very, very few reasonable alternatives. Many of the suburbs that I personally see coming up are designed to stagnate, not to grow or to be capable of anything other than being plots of land dedicated to homes. I have a lot of my own ideas on what to cover going forward for urban planning, but the fact is that the reality is that this country doesn't feel made for someone like me, someone who needs a little extra something. Despite making every attempt to make this country work for me, I want this channel fundamentally to showcase the positives in American design and the good things that happen in this country where they do exist, because they do. I just have yet to experience them firsthand. When I lived in Washington, D.C., let me tell you, it felt like a dream being able to walk from my apartment and get to a metro station in 10 minutes so I could commute into the city. It wasn't perfect, keep in mind, but I could see the surrounding areas slowly densifying and making changes that were positive to the overall network. Has anyone else felt similarly? I would love to open up dialogue to the discussion of accessibility, transit, and good urban design. I look forward to reading your replies, and I thank you for making it to the end of this video.